Calamity. Written by Jared Neely. Chapter 7. Pulling in astonishment, Jack Houston observed the road ahead of him. The menacing sight of what had become of the world spoke volumes to where the world was now. He stared out into the vast world, where his eyes began to tear. The troubling feeling of unease set into him. He felt vulnerable as he approached the immeasurable devastation. There were hundreds of vehicles linked together leading up into the valley. A traffic jam unlike anything he had ever seen. Workers, construction crews, children and families had been incinerated beyond recognition. Something unexpectedly had erased their hectic lives while they sat for the lanes to move. Jack glared across the highway and managed to find one section of the road where it had not sunken in. A clear pathway led him to the other side of the road, where he could walk willfully. He examined the unspeakable images that would forever haunt him at night from there on out. His father's fringed jacket was bundled around him, protecting him from the poisonous vapors and smoke circulating the inferno of burning bodies and miscellaneous. Ahead, he peered into the surroundings, immediately spotting a small toddler laying on his side against a car seat. He had perished, his body was stiff and his skin had melted away during the horrific explosion. He remained strapped in the seat belt, clutching onto a tiny rattle. The unicorn-shaped rattle was still tight in his fingers. Just then, Jack gazed in hideous wonder, wondering who the boy might have become if he had survived. If life had not ended the way it had. A distorted sound began to hit him as he neared another vehicle. Along its roof its tires had dissolved. Jack glared at it, running his fingers across the bare metal wheels as he passed. The road beneath him was blackened in filth, as his eyes traced the surface. Spark plugs, fragments of exhaust pipes and brake drums were strewn against the concrete in remembrance of a nightmare that had turned realistic. He kicked the debris in anger as his eyes quivered at the thought of his beloved family who were now forever gone. The sunset was just beginning to arise. He watched it closely as it came up. The magnificent sun had remained alive, unlike the faltering moon and earth where all else was extinct. He trudged along the damaged road, approaching a tan and white station wagon in the distance. All four of its doors were flung open as he peered out. A strong smell of gasoline vapors covered the air as he breathed through the jacket. His eyes were peeking out from within as he hiked towards it. The windshield along the back had spider-webbed into a trillion glass diamonds but had not fallen out. Again, his eyes circled the scene as if trying to awaken from a deep sleep. The grisly image of death and destruction reflecting from his eyes as he came closer. The plates were hanging off and wrenched into the metal as he cupped his face from the wretched odor pouring out from the car's engine block. Glass snapped underneath him as his sneakers edged the vehicle. His eyes were spread wide from behind his masked face. His hands were now at his sides as he reached the stripped shell of what was once a family wagon. His stomach turned into knots the moment his eyes caught the side window, which was rolled down and slightly hanging open. Inside was a family of 5. The husband's arms were wrapped around his wife as if protecting her from the horrendous blast. They were both now nothing more than a pillar of salt clinging to one another. Behind them were 3 small miners sitting rigid against one another with the haggard expression of being scared shitless frozen across their faces. Their skin was charred into rice paper, the ash dangling off as if that moment of utmost fear was frozen in time. Jack listened to the subtle sound of the wind as it squalled against the passenger side door as he snuck past, hoping to find the market up ahead. He continued to journey along the highway where wreckage beyond his imagination covered the road ahead and the working fields. The hike had become laborious. His feet were now blistering and burning as he reached a ramp that led down into an underground walkway into the city. A bridge covered the ramp as he entered inside, where the darkness sheltered him from the cataclysm outside. Reaching the bottom, he stopped momentarily a foot from the bridge towering over him, where the earth had split. He stared out into the wake, where everything he remembered as a boy had departed and had dematerialized and was left forgotten. At his surprise, he discovered a partially buried shopping cart with the name CJ Shopping Center across the slim barred handle. The ground had broke open and was overlaying most of it, as he leaned down to pry it up from underneath. This will come in handy, he thought as he retrieved the pitted chrome cart. Ashes covered the child's seat inside. He used his hand brushing it from it. Jack suddenly realized one of the metal wheels underneath had come loose during the pressure wave a night before. He pinched the lug nut using his sleeve as a wrench, and turned it slightly until he couldn't go any further. That should work for now, if not he would find another when he reached the market, he thought to himself. Immediately he began pushing the cart along the crumbling surface below. The cart shook while he rolled it across burnt stone and shredded magazines for expecting mothers. Jack Houston watched the ground as he pushed it forward. The thought of the moving earth reminded him of a time not so long ago, when days and nights came and went with not a worry to be had. A 9-year-old's day of reckoning was now, and therefore it would never change. Task after task would fill each day, and each task would decide his living fate. He knew this as well as the fading earth spinning slowly around him. Up ahead he fought the burning sun above his face, shielding himself desperately with one arm. He pushed the shopping cart forward. He stared ahead where 2 wooden buildings had collapsed onto each other and were still burning. A putrid gray smoke covered the polluted air above them as he peered out into the sky. Jack stood a moment, resting the cart along the littered earth. He observed the town where human life was now an open casket for the living to stare in at the dead. He thought of their faces, the many faces death had shown him. He had seen them and yet it only appeared as if he were still asleep in a bad night terror. But, it was more, this time he couldn't fight himself to awake from it. The end had arrived, devouring the world and spitting it back, as if it were displeased with the taste of what man and woman had become. For whatever reason, big or small, important or not, Jack was spared. He forced the cart through the obscenity of trash covering the entire street. The walkway into town leads straight and divided into other alleyways where local shops and pizza joints had once overthrown the lower-class area of blue-collar businesses. Jack Houston nudged the cart again, noticing it had gotten stuck. A light blue plastic newspaper bag had gotten snagged in its wheel. He shook it off using the tip of his sneaker, suddenly losing his grip along the bar. Immediately, the cart began to roll ahead of him rapidly until it suddenly collided into something hard. Whatever it was blanketed along the ground where it crashed. The cart was rock still now, as he peered in the distance, finally approaching it. It had struck a firm object not far from him, hidden underneath a hulking pile of garbage left behind. He observed how quiet it had become as he peered into the world surrounding him where nothing remained living or moving. It appeared as if the entirety of the human population along with Mother Nature and its predators were now extinct. The noiselessness was almost overbearing to him as he continued moving in the cart's direction. Jack faced the cart, reaching down, pulling it away. A heap of loose garbage collapsed along the dirt, uncovering the sleek cheekbone of a natural beauty. "Miriam," he responded, but she was already gone and had been for some time. He lifted the cardboard covering her, shoving it emotionally across the battered road. Unnerved, he gazed at her gracefully, wondering what kind of wicked person had done this senseless act of brutality. His heart was hardening before him as he stepped away in disbelief. His breathing had become heavy and tightened as he fought his 9-year-old mind to comprehend that there weren't any laws left now, not here, not in the Armageddon. Staring at her once again, he began to realize there would be no stopping the nature of what the world he was living in. He then clutched onto her using all of his strength, and laid her gently into the cart. Her body had been ravaged, she had been sexually violated and bitten. Her flowing floral dress hung over the old cart, as he examined the natural beauty with the same kind of retribution he had felt for his father. "They will pay, Miriam, this will not go unjustified, I promise you this," he thought to himself. His frustration began to build, angrily, his hands quivering and clutching against the handle. His eyes fixed against the street ahead, where he pushed the captivating beauty along the narrow walkway. Immediately he observed an aging building standing unharmed. It stood between two others, which had burned into the night and were now remnants of the past. The desolate world around him stunk of death and rotten trash. Oblivious, with his face buried deep inside of his father's jacket, he stared into the unforeseeable. "Hey you, over there!" shouted a bristly voice, a man's voice. Jack immediately spun around to see who had called out. "What do you have there, boy?" the voice queried again. The seeking voice questioned him from within the wreckage. Jack traced the voice unsuccessfully. "Who's asking? Come on out and show yourself like man," he shouted, staring cautiously into the fire and debris surrounding him. The world became muted again, only the sound of the ruffling fire and trash left behind could be heard. "I said, come on out," Jack shouted, much more aggressive this time. "I have nothing left to lose, you hear me?" he cried. "My father was all I had." He stared at the building standing ahead of him, holding the cart. He peered at Miriam and immediately thought of Levi. In the back of his mind, he wished he had not left them behind. Chapter 8 Miriam's eye. "What do you have there, son? Is that your lady love?" responded the unfamiliar voice. Jack turned and peered in towards the buildings closest to him, clutching the cart. Unable to distinguish where it had come from, Jack's wondering eyes fixed against the building and hollered once again, "We're just passing through, you hear me? We don't need any trouble here," he shrieked, staring down at Miriam's mangled corpse. Everything then turned silent as he stood awaiting the man to speak again. Jack slowly pushed again, leading the old cart towards the other end of the littered road. A strange odor suddenly came over him as he overlooked the buildings burning in the distance. An odd smoke began to pour from the chimney of the lone undamaged building nearest to him. He watched the sky as the dreadful smelling haze unraveled into the nightmarish clouds. Immediately, something inside one of the windows had moved inwards and stared him head to head. Jack's eyes were fighting to stay open. The polluted air had picked up and had blown debris over his way. He shoved the trash away and tightened his fingers against the cart holding Levi's beloved sister. "We have all types of food here, little man, come on in, son," cried a rugged man's voice, and just then he could see him glaring out from within the darkness. "I'm not your son, mister, my father is gone," he hollered up at the man. The scheming man's face was still shielded by the darkness, standing just inside the brick two-storied building. The cunning man in his mid-40s began scratching vigorously along his upper shoulder, where there appeared to be an old blood stain. Jack observed him a moment, noticing his blue denim jean jacket was ripped along the chest pocket where a patch had been sewn. He attempted to read it, but it was out of distance. He was hesitant to come near him. He began to push the cart over top a layer of metal roofing that had been thrown a night before. Particles of shingles peeled apart and filled with jagged nails covered the area where he stood, watching the watchful man. "It might not smell like much, but it's more than enough. Why don't you park that heap and come inside like I said?" the leggy man said, soliciting him for an answer. He stood about 6'5" and had dark brown hair to his chin, which from where Jack was standing, appeared unwashed for some time. "We have candy? And kids. You won't find any of that out there," the man said, raising his arm as he pointed to the roaring buildings. "I see, it's because I'm a stranger, right?" He paused a brisk moment as Jack stood wary of the man's intentions. Jack's sudden instincts told him to run, but he couldn't, not without Miriam. "Well, son. Have it your way. But don't come crying back when you find nothing left in these fucking wastelands." The angered man immediately turned towards the doorway and entered inside, leaving him there. Jack watched closely as he disappeared into the dark room, where he sensed another man waiting. The dark hallway devoured him as he entered inside, leaving Jack in question of his motive to get him inside. Were there really children his age to play with inside? Was there really food? He wondered unfathomably a minute, glaring at the building. Abruptly, before Jack could continue his way towards the market, The greasy man erupted through the darkness of the doorway, confronting him. "Get the fuck over here now, you little shit." His hands were clasped around a homemade shiv. Hastily aiming it towards him, he charged and missed. The man plummeted against the dirt. Jack caught his balance, peering at the man who had fallen onto the grubby surface. "I'll slice your fucking heart out, twerp. You hear me, runt?" He clamored at him, breathing heavily. He was now livid and trembling in rage. Struggling back onto his feet, he peered at Jack again, but even more hostile. Jack suddenly tripped against the cart, landing awkwardly against the hardened grass. He peered towards the cart where Miriam was staring at him as if still alive in some outlandish way. Her eyes were apart and glaring into him, almost as if warning him this moment would be the first of many high-risk encounters. Resisting the man's attempt, he pulled his right leg out from underneath him. Lifting his bruised body, he realized his left ankle was sprained and burning. He quickly planted his shoes against the grain, ignoring his ailing leg where pain began to shoot up his lower calf. "You better get a head start, you shit-faced kid. I'm going to divulge your innocent tongue after I cut it off and ingest your fucking insides. Ha ha ha, and then I'll shit you out and do it all over again." He howled at him. "You see that smoke rising, little boy?" He squawked at Jack not far from him. He flailed his arms in hatred, pointing up at the chimney. "That's your friends, that's your whole fucking family burning. You're what's on our plate, kid. You are on our food chain, bitch boy," the struggling man said, chuckling joyfully as he scuffled to get back onto his feet. He was wearing a set of woman's bearskin boots and had on holey jeans that were too short. He gawked at the man once again before peering out into the burning world beyond the buildings for safety. "Daddy's coming for you now, kid," the unhygienic man howled as he gained his balance. Jack ignored him, hastily bolting to get away as his shoes pattered against the gritty surface underneath him. Abandoning Miriam in the cart, he scrambling for the woodland behind the searing buildings. "I'll rip you limb to limb when I get my hands against her flailing body," the ill-natured man began shouting murderously, chasing after him. Jack could hear the man not far behind, panicking, his chest turned in knots at the thought of the cannibalistic man. He darted across the filth and muck blanketing the road where he noticed a vacant structure ahead of him. H's leg was hampering him as he made his way to it, leaving the road and the woodland ahead of him in the distance. "Ha ha ha ha!" the sick laughter of the urgent man bellowed behind him in the growing darkness. Jack approached the front of it, quickly leaping onto the stairwell, hiding inside the dark. The solid wood mantel door had been forcefully removed from the framing. His eyes fixed against the darkness where tiny beams of sunshine fought to get in. The entire building appeared to have been looted. Nothing remained on the first floor except for scraps of drywall. It hung from within the framework and on the floor near him as he uncovered his face. He then put his father's fringed jacket around himself, moving towards the stairwell leading into the second level. The stairs were noisy as he stepped foot onto them, creeping sluggishly to the top, awaiting the man to come inside after him. "Knock, knock, knock," the man's desperate voice echoed through the emptied Army-Navy surplus building. "I'm a-coming for ya, and this time you will not be leaving here in one piece," he shouted, as he peered inside with the shiv still constrained against his cruddy hand. "I will take it easy on you if you come out now and play with Daddy," he whispered faintly, listening for Jack to slip up. His eyes were tracing the spacious room. Upstairs, Jack glared frantically for a safer place to hide from the man as he reached the top step onto the aging wood. Inside it was dark and dingy and reeked of rotten flesh. There were a handful of rooms along the floor as he stared, momentarily searching for an escape. He pulled his leg behind him as he scampered silently into the first doorway. The door had been left ajar. The room was decorated in old European-style wallpaper. Tiny red roses with green stems covered every inch of the room. Somebody had once used as a spare room to stack surplus. He could hear the steps leading up as they hissed and snapped underneath the man's skin-made boots. Immediately, Jack shut the door and turned the brass knob until it latched. He searched it for a lock, but it required a skeleton key, so it was pointless. His hands began to tremble at the thought of the chimney outside, and that atrocious smell carrying into the wind. The smell of burning men, women and children, being cooked and eaten. His stomach was queasy and hungry, but never would he divulge another human being at any cost. Although, he believed he would never commit murder, and he had. It ate at him as he observed the dark room. Along the far wall was a sizable window that had been boarded shut using scraps. He approached it and clasped his hands onto the wood, but it was screwed into place. The man outside would be there in seconds if he couldn't find a way out, he thought. Again, at the window he pulled with all his force, unable to pry it apart. Suddenly, examining his front pocket, he remembered seeing a man use a coin to turn screws loose. He wasn't as fortunate. He was penniless, but it just so happened he ignored a old brass label holder laying along the doorway as he entered inside. He across the room for it, being as stealthy as he could, clutching it in palm. It must have broken off of a library filing cabinet at one time, he wondered as he made way back to the window. The edge was thinner than the screw as he pushed against the metal, panicking. "Come on, turn, damn it, turn!" Jack cried, whimpering, knowing the man was just outside the door. "That's it, come on, I'm not dying here, you hear me," he thought, as it began to turn slightly. Right away the door flung open. And he was standing him down, writhing the bladed knife. Jack glared at him, a tiny glimmer of light glinted from the tip of the shiv as he approached him. "Never, and I mean never, run from me, son. Now I'll make certain that your death will be slow and torturous." "Ha, ha," the man cackled as he gripped hold of him, tightening his fingers around his collar. He finally given in, permitting the much stronger man to lead him from the room. "Now you worthless piece of shit, get down them fucking stairs," the man shouted, still grappling him by the neck of his shirt. "I am mister, I am, just take it slow, my leg's been wounded," Jack cried, sobbing to him. The psychopathic man then gripped him harder, pulling him up against his face. "Oh, you're hurt, boy. Really? And?" He then paused, staring him inches away. His eyes were at the same level, staring at Jack as he held him high against himself. Well, we can't have that, can we? How about a ride?" he responded. "You like rides, don't ya, bitchy bitch?" the man asked, and then waited momentarily for him to speak, clutching him above the stairs leading down into the room below. His eyes burned of pure hatred and his mouth reeked of human body parts. Jack hesitated. Not really," he wailed frantically. The man suddenly let go of him, now standing behind him. "Well, to put it frankly, take one anyways," he hollered at him, throwing fetid spit from his horrible mouth. Immediately winding up to hit him with all of his strength, Jack could sense the man's rage growing from behind. Without warning, the man released a brutal punch into Jack's 9-year-old skull. Jack's eyes widened at the instant stabbing of pain unfurling his tiny body. His eyes rolled back into darkness as he descended forward. Recklessly tumbling downwards, his body striking each stair on the way down. He thwacked against the railing awkwardly until he came to a sliding stop near the bottom. Chapter 9. Skinned. His eyes twitched and fought to open as he laid against the cold surface. The concrete underneath him was wet and smelled unpleasant. He opened his eyes to see, the same terrible smell from outside filled the room surrounding him as he coughed and spit onto the floor. It wasn't the same place where he had fallen, he had been dragged or carried or both, he thought to himself, laying silently underneath the tangled lights. Overhead hung a chandelier assembled together with various strands and sizes of leftover Christmas lights. They hung over him as he laid motionless and beaten after being belted by the stairs. The lights had been plugged in and harnessed into a junk Delco car battery. It was positioned along the dirt not far from where he was laying. He stared at it a split second, wondering if his life too was a moment away from being gutted and served to feed the hungry man and his radical friends. The glowing red and green lights were dangling above him, blinking simultaneously on a timer. The lights flickered against his dirty face glowing in the darkness. His arms were flat against his sides as he peered from side to side, observing the musty cellar. Across from him, just ahead of his legs, he could feel a great heat radiating from a large red and white brick-built oven, although he wondered if it were actually a oven or if it were something much more darker. He had not seen anything like it, ever. It was box-shaped and built of fireproof brick, and had double doors upon the front of it. It disturbed him considerably as he stared in curiosity. He attempted to rise from the ground, but his feet and arms were tethered tightly. The man had done it, keeping him captive along the floor. "This is it, the man will catch me and this will be where I die," he thought, worrying to himself. "I'm sorry, Father, I need something more than what you have given me," he spoke inside, feeling distressed, silently praying for the man not to return into the room. A moment later, the man from earlier came stumbling drunkenly down into the roasting basement. He stopped and peered at him along the floor, standing inches from him. "Hello there, beauty queen, I see you had your cat nap." "Ha, ha, ha, it's about time for dinner, young man. I have a special surprise for you, son," he said, leaning over towards Jack, giving him a light pat alongside his cheek. "How about a look-see inside the kettle cooker, young'un?" he asked him. Without allowing him to reply back, he gripped him up and carried him with his arms. "Keep your feet downward, son, I'll bring you over for a peek inside," he added, dragging him forcefully to the oven's front. He then took a deep breath in, and let out a howl. "Now that, I tell you, boy, is home fried cooking." His eyes were gleaming as he held on to Jack's arms. His body was abused from the fall as he stood in front of the man. Jack stared at the oven as he hung from the man's arms. "Flossenberg?" was printed alongside the handles. He could hear the sound of the sizzling flames from inside. It reminded him of a time when his mother burned the holiday Easter ham. At the time he was only 6 years old, about to turn 7. His mother was a proficient cook. That was the only time he could remember her doing something like that. "George, hey, Georgie, get down here a moment. I want to show this shit-for-nothing runt how real men survive in the world nowadays," he shouted with his eyes still on young Jack's. No longer than a moment later, another man barreled down with the two standing at the massive oven. "What is it, Murray? We have 15 of us up here waiting to eat, damn it, you're wasting time with this chicken cutlet," he responded back to him. "Now, I know you have a history of this kind of thing, but this is not the time, Mur," he said, leaning inwards towards the oven with both hands. He gripped the doors on both ends, pulling them open. The mighty heat of the fire hit them as they backed away, while staring inside. "Jesus, Murray, I thought I told you about using that rotted meat? That bitch was dead for too long, you stupid son of a bitch," he said, poking her with a small iron shovel. Jack was horrified in disbelief, watching Miriam inside. Her skin had melted away where meat dangled loosely from her bare bones. Her hair was gone and her mouth was agape as if crying out one final time. "George, you fucking worry your ass off with all of the little petty shit. This bitch didn't have one spot of tainted meat on her," he said, licking his fingers off as if he could taste her already. George turned towards him and cracked a half smile. "You're one sick bastard, I guess that is why we respect how you get things done around here," he added, finally shutting the doors. I have to say it, you sure have the touch when it comes to basting up a good-for-nothing Amish bitch like this one," he said, which caused both of them to laugh hysterically. "Well, Georgie, that coming from you means a lot. You did have your hands in this one as well, I have to give you at least that satisfaction," he responded. George then spun around towards the stairs and stopped right before the first step. "Take this one slow, buddy, them youngsters hold better flavor when they're cooked less, it just seems the meat peels apart and it's nice and tender when they're still kicking, get me, Mur?" He then chuckled. Murray nodded back, agreeing with him. George left and went back upstairs to the others. Jack could hear them up there now. They sounded like a pack of hungry wolves fighting over a leg quarter. Jack wondered to himself if it were Georgie or Murray who were in charge, or if it were one or the other. It would only be a matter of time before they two turned against each other. Once the food was out. "Damn son, I love this crematory oven. It's not like them junk ovens made of tin, you know the ones, them ovens made in China or Japan, blah, blah, blah. Don't got to worry about them foreigners anymore, do we now?" he said smiling, and then sighed. "How old are you anyways, boy?" he asked him, sitting him back down against the concrete. "Now don't you move, squirt, I don't want to cut you just yet. You heard Georgie, he's expecting you to be ripe." "Ha, ha, ha." He glared at him again, quickly surveying the room. The basement had been gutted and was now used as some sort of butchering room. He had never been in a funeral parlor but had seen them on television. "9, please. Just let me go, I won't come back here, just let me leave," he pleaded, but Murray had already begun to pull Miriam out from within the extreme heat. "It's never that easy, Pippi, not when we have extended family waiting upstairs." Jack wondered about the nickname, Pippi. He remembered a girl on television named Pippi who wore long pigtails. The thought of being called it felt downright degrading, but he remained silent along the floor. "You mind if I call you that for now on, Yunjin?" he asked him, suddenly lifting her body from the oven. He sat her hollowed corpse along a short table to his side. The table was stained in aged blood and resembled a butcher's block. Murray then began to dig his fingernails deep into Miriam's steaming torso. "MMM, MMM, MMM, now that is what I call some cluckety, cluckety," he said, suddenly tearing off a piece of her cooked flesh. "If I knew it tasted like this, I would have had people over more often," he murmured, smiling, while Jack glared horrifyingly from the floor. He felt disgusted and nauseous as he glared into Murray's face standing a foot from the oven's entranceway. He closed his eyes to the sound of her fleshy skin between the man's hungry lips smacking downwards. He then peered up at him, divulging her, watching his yellowed teeth grind against one another. His eyes fluttered in disbelief as he studied Miriam's skin between Murray's lips. The thought of it was paralyzing. With a little Tabasco sauce and some greens and this bitch would be untouchable, not even Mama's pork roast would have come close, he said, turning his attention back at Jack along the filthy floor. Jack closed his eyes again, hoping that Murray would turn back towards Miriam, but he didn't. "When the world fails you, son, like it had us, them upstairs, Georgie and I, we all must turn into savage beasts," he said, raising his hand to his mouth yet again. "We're wild animals, boy, who is to say we shouldn't be this way?" He added, "Do you think God above us doesn't understand what we're trying to do here? Well, He does. It's just up to us now. It's up to us to repopulate the nation, eat children along with whoever else to survive, and it's up to us to keep order." Chapter 10. The oven. Jack's eyes stretched open, hoping that he wasn't finished with Miriam, but it appeared he was. Murray, did you put that dim-wit kid in yet?" Another man's voice shouted down into the cellar where the two were. "This isn't a fucking AA meeting, Murr, we are waiting up here, come on man, socialize somewhere else man, we're hungry." Murray's face immediately turned bright red. "Hey asshole, keep popping off with me, you son of a bitch, and you will be cremated next, you sorry ass piece of dog shit," he shouted angrily up at him. A split second later a thump from above occurred, and the others above the two began to howl and cry. "Don't do it, Bobby!" cried a unfamiliar woman's voice. "Put it down, we can wait, Bobby!" shouted another man. "It's not worth it!" bawled another woman. "Yes it is, stop him!" cried another from the far side of the room. "Let him go, Barry, take it from him, I'm not in this." The voices from above were panicking and things were suddenly smashing along the floor upstairs. The sound of glass and broken dishes shattered above them, echoing above the two in the dark. "If that asshole comes down here I'll show you who runs the show, little man," Murray said, clutching onto the same shiv he had earlier. "I'll cut his aorta and drink the blood from his spouting throat, you'll see." he said, but Jack could see the instant worry in his eyes. "Murray!" bellowed the pissed-off man, as the door flung open and a man began to enter down into the room with them. Jack watched the man's shoes as he entered down into the room. He had made it nearly 2 steps and then stopped as if listening for something. He had on heavy black boots with the symbol of a Harley-Davidson logo on one side. Murray remained silently standing a few feet from the stairwell, gripping onto the pointed shank. The man stood there a moment, hesitating to come down. Jack's eyes traced them in the dark, wondering what was about to unfold. The same Christmas lights flashed above him as he listened quietly to the others up above. Along the filthy floor he could smell Miriam's body still radiating heat not far from him. Murray turned a split moment towards Jack and put his finger across his mouth as if to stay quiet. The man not far from him stood motionless and breathing, holding something, but the wall above the cellar was blocking it from his view. Immediately, the man turned back towards the door above and stepped upwards to leave, as if he had a change of heart. Without warning, the surprised man began to gasp, leaving out a chilling shriek of horrendous pain. He stood above them along the steps panting for oxygen. They were both in shock watching him as he fell backwards along the stairs. Listening for a second, just then a thudding body rolled down into the room with them. "Holy foo!" thought Jack, now peering towards Murray, who was also quite surprised. The others upstairs were now silent and not moving around anymore. Their chairs were still and their voices were muted. Jack and Murray were down below peering at each other, but not one word was spoken. "Don't think you're getting out of this, Pippi, because you're not," Murray said, pointing the shift towards him, attempting to intimidate him. "You're the livestock, fucker, nothing more. Nobody will miss you when you're gone, kid, not your father, not your mama, and not your fucking school counselors who are all dead anyways," he whispered to him standing along the stairs sheltered by the brick wall. "Now, you stay quiet and I'll take a look-see around before I head on up there," he said. Jack remained motionless along the surface. His hands and legs were bruised and tied tight together. He peered at Murray as he approached the stairs leading out of the cellar. He tiptoed up the stairs until he reached the highest step, where the door was open in front of him. Jack could no longer see him as he laid along the hard ground just beyond the oven. The thought of being eaten entangled his mind as he awaited them to sooner or later get him. Jack wondered why Murray had not returned. Moments had passed and he hadn't heard any distinct noises coming from above. The people, the others, were they scared? He wondered to himself. Maybe they were just like him, maybe they were forced to eat human meat, maybe they weren't as sick or demented as Murray or Georgie. The questions were unimportant at the moment, as he lay there against the grubby floorway breathing in Miriam's burnt aroma. He gasped at the thought of it, wanting to vomit, but he was unable to. He had not eaten anything since the cataclysm. Miriam, are you down there? Make a noise," shouted a familiar voice from above the cellar door. He recognized the accent. It was him, or was it? He wondered. Was it Levi? But how could he have found him? Immediately, he could hear the sound of hard soles pattering against the wooden stairwell. They were coming down the stairs into the darkness where he awaited someone to find him. Jack glared at the man's pant legs as he came towards the bottom, realizing it wasn't Levi at all. It wasn't Levi, it was. "It's you, Jack, right? Did they take ya? Where's Miriam?" shouted the young boy, as Jack stared up at him. "Josiah. Where is Levi, is he with you?" He quickly questioned him, but Josiah was concentrating on the oven not far from the two. Taking his eyes from it, his head dropped, realizing the body in the darkness. His eyes were squinting from the smoke as he approached the butcher's block in the shadows. He peered at his once beautiful sister, flat against the wooden top of the butcher's table. What was left of her? "Shameless," he said, whimpering against her. He held her face in both hands and gave her a slight peck along her forehead, which was now nothing but ash and flaking skin. "We cannot be here, Jack, this is a ungodly place for a man," he said, sobbing softly. A moment later he left her, and untied the knots holding Jack from leaving. "Come now, be fast, Jack, there is only death and no justice here." Grime and tears covered his dirty face as he took his arm, pulling him towards the stairs. "Where is Murray?" asked a panicking Jack, hesitating to go up. "He will kill you and I if he sees us," he whispered to him. Josiah said nothing, shaking his head and pulling him up anyways. "Stop it, Josiah!" he cried. "I heard them up there. They will pillage our bodies, and eat us if we leave that way," he cried, but Josiah again ignored him. "Come on, stupid boy, now, there is no time to waste here," he shouted, forcing him to leave. Approaching the doorway, a thick puddle of blood trickled along the stairs. Both boys overstepped it, staring into a large dining room. Jack was standing behind Josiah, who was still clutching his arm. Immediately, his eyes caught Levi on the far end of the room. "Levi, it's you, I'm glad you're alive," he shouted towards him, but Levi was not listening. He was kneeling on his knees and in front of Murray. Murray was bleeding and sitting against his back on a high, wooden chair. His head was down but he was breathing. Levi was speaking to him in an unfamiliar language and praying at the foot of him. Levi's hair was matted back, and his hat was at his side along the gritty floor. Jack stared at the two, and then at Josiah, realizing the others were nowhere to be found or seen. The wolves were gone, the hungry had oddly left. He wondered if it was something Murray had said earlier in the cellar, about the order. Maybe he was the leader there in some off-the-wall way. Maybe he kept the order going, and maybe after he was gone the order would still move flowingly as it did already. The large abandoned room surrounding them was lit up brightly, and sunlight was coming in from all angles. The windows along the furthest wall were open, allowing the sky to climb inside. Pub tables and benches were lined up horizontally and decorated with glassware as if the dinner bell was about to sound. The only thing was, nobody was there to feast. Glass and broken mugs were scattered about the floor not far from Josiah and Jack. The scuffle he had heard minutes earlier had vanished, leaving behind an untold tale of what happened and why. Georgie was lying against a bench a few feet from Levi. Jack wondered how he had won it. He was dead. Somehow Levi snuck inside without being pummeled. The thought confused him as he approached Levi and Murray sitting across the room. "Levi, how did you get inside with all of them?" "I'm at a loss, you two saved my life," he said. Levi finally acknowledged him standing behind him. He stood up in front of Murray and turned towards Jack holding the shiv. "Miriam," he said her name, and shook his head in disgust. "This is what he used, isn't it?" he questioned Jack, already knowing the answer. "This petty blade, as if my sister wasn't anything but a side fixing, but this gutless pig will learn today what she was to me. Hold on to this, Jack," he said, and handing him the homemade shank. Dried blood clung to the metal along the blade as he observed it. "I don't want this, Levi, you take it," he said, but Levi pushed his fingers tightly against it. "Bring it with us to the cellar." Jack wondered why he said it, but didn't hesitate this time. A moment later, Josiah and Levi bent forward and cut Murray loose from the chair. "Stay there, mister," he whispered to Murray, still sitting and badly bleeding. His shirt was ripped from the bottom up and his insides were showing. "This will show you that the Amish community will retaliate when pushed," he shouted, suddenly kneeling towards the floor again. "I got his ankles, mate," he said, holding them in his grasp. Josiah stepped over closer and held a piece of plated glass from the floor against Murray's skin. "Are you ready, Levi?" he asked him, steadying his feet. "Yes, I am, more than ever. Cut his ankles deep high, so he can't walk no more," he said. Jack was now watching from afar. Immediately, Josiah pressed the glass into the back of Murray's ankles, slicing them across until the tendons were severed. He screamed in agony, convulsing in pain. "Grab me one of those hand towels, Jack," Levi shouted towards him. Jack suddenly approached him, hastily dropping one onto the floor inches from the three. "This isn't for you, mister," he said, cleaning his hands of the blood. "Josiah, get a good grip of him, we're taking him to the cellar," he said, baffling both him and Jack, who were now staring at him in curiosity. "Jack, come on, get a hand on him and help us move him down there," he said, and Jack obeyed his wishes. Knowing he would have been dead if it weren't for the brothers. "You take his arms and I'll take his legs, if he drops just let him go," Levi said, as they began to carry him towards the doorway leading down into the dreary darkness. The smell of burnt body parts filled the air as they reached the stairs leading down. "Oh my, what has this man done, Miriam? What has he done to you?" Levi said softly, realizing the horror that had taken place inside. "Josiah, open the oven," Levi demanded him while they balanced Murray's trembling body in their arms. "Don't do this," Murray cried to them, "you can't do this to me, I'll be back and I'll make sure you die for this." He screamed as loud as he could. "I'd like to see that," said Levi. "Now, put him inside, death will set him free of all the burden he had put on Miriam," he murmured, and then raised his arm to unlatch the oven doors. The doors swung open, releasing a dead heat, a blistering heat. A heat so great that from the touch of it, could take your skin off within a split second. "Goodbye, Murray, your end is now. But when you arrive in hell, remember one thing, you're the one who put you there," Levi said, and then sighed, as the three boys slid him inside along his back. His body convulsed as fire erupted around him, his hands began to quiver as he began to scream. Fire and smoke smoldered his face, melting away his skin until the bones showed. The fire engulfed him as he glared out at Jack. "I'll haunt you," he squawked one final time as they shut the doors in front of him. He howled in agony until they reached the outside, where the sun was still overhead, risen above the town. A short moment later, Murray's harrowing wailing had died off, along with himself. He was gone as quick as he came into Jack's life. "Look over there, Jack, do you see the church in the distance?" asked Levi, who was walking beside Josiah in the same direction. Burning embers blew into him as he stared at it. There was a small field beyond a row of collapsed buildings and a church that sat diagonal to a sinking school. The middle school was enveloped in fire and was smoking high into the clouds above. They boys admired it a moment as they stood watching from 40 yards out. An American airline had crash-landed on top of it. Levi put his arm around Jack and peered at him with a slight smirk across his unwashed face. "I'm guessing 300 or more died in that crash," he said, and then pointed to the church ahead of them. Jack glared at him a moment, wondering why he was pointing vigorously at the Baptist church. "I watched them enter inside no longer than 20 minutes ago," he said. Jack observed him. His rounded Amish hat was now smeared with gray ash as it continued falling onto them. "Who exactly are we talking about here?" replied Jack. "Do you mean that pack of hungry wolves who just about slaughtered me?" he asked him, now picking ash from his hair. Levi and Josiah looked at each other and then nodded towards him. "That is where them fools stow away, they pray together inside before they devour human beings, as if they can be forgiven for the very acts we're taught since day one to never uphold," Levi said, sounding dark. "I witnessed them once before ravishing the land of human blood, but I ran. This time I will not," he added, pounding his fist into his palm. "I cannot bear to see it any longer, Jack." Jack peered out into the open sky where the clouds had changed and were darker than the night before. Although, a brilliant sunshine was still gleaming through them. Unusual weather it was, the wind was subtle as it rained ash and glowing embers from above. "I sure hope these clouds are not the sign of a monstrous storm," Jack said, staring out into space. "There isn't a storm brewing, Jack, that's God answering our calls to humanity," he added, noticing Jack's growing eyes.